Hello and welcome to this week's review for Movie Magpies, where we will be rating The Prestige. I'm Monique, and I'm here with my co-host Will. How about we just get right into it?
Alright, for the people who don't know, Monique, what is the Prestige?
Well, the Netflix summary of The Prestige is desperate to reveal each other's secrets, two rival magicians begin to perform increasingly risky tricks, which soon turn deadly. Basically, it's a movie that sort of looks into, I guess, the behind the scenes of very early magic tricks.
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually going to say that the summary I don't think the Netflix summary does justice to what this film is or tries to achieve. I think there's a great deal more and the summary is quite vague, but ultimately the Prestige is basically a film about two rival magicians trying to one up each other while also trying to fuck each other over for various reasons, but ultimately that's the main basis of the film, with the added caveat that one of the magicians has just debuted a new magic trick that is gonna rule the scene of magic for years to come. And the other wants to get their hands on it as a form of revenge for something that happens quite early on in the film.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I find that a lot of summaries for more in-depth films like this never quite hit the mark anyway.
Yeah.
Because, of course, this film does, like I say, explore more of the behind the scenes. It also explores how this friendship turned sour and sort of, I suppose, ruined the relationship between these two men as their rivalry became less friendly and more destructive.
Yeah, it was, I think even early on from the beginning of the film, it was less about competition but more about revenge in certain sections of the film. And I think we should just break down these points by talking about the two main characters, Angier, played by our very own Hugh Jackman, and Borden, who is played by Christian Bale. Both of these characters have a very strong passion for magic, and as a result, one of the leading points in this film is the death of Angier's wife, which is caused by accident at the hands of Borden. As a result, this leads to a butterfly effect of both of these magicians one-upping each other and impeding their shows.
Yeah, it's super interesting how they devolve because in the very start of the film, of course, we see them being quite friendly to each other.
Yeah.
They're laughing, they're joking, and this film does a really good job of foreshadowing what's going to happen. And I think one of the things that foreshadows the wife's death is when they're talking about knots
Yeah.
and the way that they're tying them. And if anything happened and that knot slipped or it was too tight, she's not going to get out of there. She'll really hurt herself. She could even
Well,
die.
Michael Caine says it's not the knot that Borden is proposing they use, which is a more useful knot or a more versatile knot. He says the line, "It's not a wet knot," which infers that the knot reacts differently when soaked in water. But then Angie's wife reassures Michael Caine's character, stating that she can untie that knot, don't worry, it'll be fine. But there's this breakdown in communication that becomes a tense foreshadowing to the next events in the moment where she does die because she can't untie the knot. But no one knows which knot they tied.
Because in the heat of the moment, and of course everything that happens, nobody really remembers or
Yeah.
can tell.
And I think this story does a really good job of presenting foreshadowing information in a way that on a first viewing can build a sense of tension, on a second viewing increases that more so. And I think it's going to be the one thing that I say most about this film is that this film is great on a first viewing. It is monumentally better on a second viewing.
I, in fact, hadn't seen this movie before we decided to watch it. So we watched it once together, and then I, in my own time, just before recording, actually watched it again, specifically so that I could get that second time experience. And also, of course, if you're watching a film critically and taking notes on it, you sometimes miss things because you're too busy burying your head in your keyboard, which for me was really, really interesting. I immediately saw what you meant with some of those more foreshadowing
Yeah.
times. And I think the film does a really good job of putting its foreshadowing elements right in front of your eye
Yeah.
without the viewer realizing. It's that sort of magic trick
Yeah,
of
that was
hidden in
exactly
plain
what I was going
sight.
to say.
Yeah, which really helps
Yeah,
echo the
I think.
whole vibe of the film.
Yeah, I think the film does a really good job of remaining consistent to its subject matter in that a lot of the use of narrative and story building aspects in this film are done in a way that mimics the illusionist's repertoire or presentation. And I think that's really, really cool and a lot of fun and really adds so much more depth to this film in a way that, of course, that being said, without it, it wouldn't ruin the film, but like, it just makes this film so much more than it seems on the surface, and definitely more than the Netflix summary gives off. Because we don't want to spoil anything in this review, of course. We want you to go and see it. Absolutely watch this film. Watch it again as well, just because it just gets even better with the second time viewing. But I wanted to ask you, with this dynamic of rivalry between two magicians played by two strong actors, Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman, how do you think that dynamic went? What do you feel about the chemistry between Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale, just as actors? And maybe as characters if you feel like answering that too.
Well, obviously, as characters, that's probably something I would leave more to the in-depth, just because I
That's
don't
fair
want to
enough.
accidentally spoil anything. But as actors, I think they might have gotten along pretty well. I feel like they're the type of actors where they have quite big personalities.
Yeah,
Of course, it's Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman. Who are we talking about here? But I feel like they would have had that sort of camaraderie, almost that the characters did in the first, you know, 20, 30 minutes of this film, where they were kind of ribbing at each other a lot, like throwing jabs back and forth,
sure.
but mostly just as something to do. Yeah, I don't know, really. I
Well,
hadn't thought about that. That was a
yeah.
really good question.
Well, for me, I think between Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale, I think the two mesh incredibly well together in a way that I don't know of any other film they've been in together past this one. Again, this film came out in 2006, so they probably worked together again. But I really like the chemistry between these two because it meshes quite well, and there are certain points in this film where I think there is a little less chemistry between actors. One point, for example, and I'm not blaming anyone for this, but Hugh Jackman and David Bowie, I don't think have a strong chemistry with each other, and it can be passed off as anything basically. David Bowie is a musician and not an actor, so ultimately I don't think it's a bad chemistry. I just think that David Bowie's not a really proficient actor, and this is quite a high-grade film. So ultimately, I will admit, when I saw Bowie in this film, I was like, "Oh, sweet, it's David Bowie, excellent." And his acting did not matter at all for me. But in a purely critical analysis of the film, the acting is definitely slightly more noticeable from Bowie, just because he's not quite as proficient at playing anything other than Bowie, who is this vibrant, incredibly interesting character. But then he has to play someone like Nikola Tesla, and it's just like, that's a man who actually existed.
I think we were actually talking about this when we watched the
Yeah.
film, and one of my quotes I think I said is, no matter what David Bowie's in, he's always going to make his character the most dramatic
Yeah.
person,
And I
like
think,
within context,
yeah,
because that's the thing is everybody thinks of Tesla as this incredibly apt scientist, obviously.
yeah.
It's Nikola Tesla. But the way that David Bowie played him was almost like he was at the whim of the
Yeah.
environment that he was studying, and
Well,
he
the
had
whim
this
of
very
science, yeah.
yeah, he had this very dramatic way of playing a very straight-laced scientific character. He still managed to make it seem a little bit otherworldly, and
Yeah.
it's just very amusing to me because
Oh, yeah, it's a
obviously
lot
he's
of
not an
fun.
actor. I think even he commented on it and was like,
Yeah.
didn't you say that he had a quote or something that he didn't
Yeah,
his accent was good?"
he talked about his role in this film, and he said my accent was shit, but I enjoyed doing the film all the same. And I think that's just I think that's a very Bowie remark. I personally really love David Bowie, just in general, and I really enjoyed him in this film, but it was just a overall kind of blanket analysis that ultimately he knew that he probably wasn't very good in this, but he did it anyway. He had a really good time, and I think you can also just tell that. And I think what's really fun about this film and makes this film so much more enjoyable for me personally is that this is a star-studded cast, I think, but genuinely like very strong, dramatic acting cast. All of the actors in this know what they're doing. They're incredibly good at what they're doing. And then there's David Bowie, who's just like, hello, I have a shit mustache and I'm having a good time.
Which is super amusing because I think Nolan even almost handpicked Bowie for the part.
Of course, you would. Though.
And couldn't imagine anybody else playing him because he was like, it's such a small role, but I can't imagine anybody else doing it because it's still very integral. And I think that's very, very funny that it does have this kind of infamous or very famous cast about it.
Absolutely.
But they all mesh together really well, and you still get immersed in the film.
And before we shoot off into something else, I just want to quickly commend Andy Serkis. This was during a time where he was more well known for his mocap work, but people forget that Andy Serkis is an incredibly nuanced actor, and my belief is that they pushed Andy Serkis into mocap because they're like, this guy's too good. This guy's too powerful. Put him into mocap, make him Gollum, make him... I don't remember the ape's name from Planet of the Apes, but make him an ape. Make him do all these other things. Keep him busy, and then he won't be acting because he's great. Because he's a little too good. And we're not okay with that.
Amazingly, the thing about Andy Serkis is that he's just got such clear expressions, which makes him really good at acting. Of course, it makes him very good for mocap because it makes it very easy to capture the expression.
Sure.
But he does a really good job of having a very almost more stage rather than movie expression, but he never comes off as like over dramatic or like too expressive. He does a really good job of balancing the two. And I guess you end up in mocap if you have that type of face because it does make it much easier to capture that. But he really doesn't just have the expressions, he also has the acting to go underneath it. It's not just that his face makes these gorgeous expressions, it's that you can believe that it's the character who is feeling whatever they're feeling in that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we'll move on from the actors and the characters as a whole. I think we definitely get a good point there across there, but we'll discuss them more in depth in our in-depth review if we feel like doing so. But I want to say just quickly, in terms of cinematography, I don't think there's a whole lot there to criticize. I think it does a lot well with what it has. I think its standout cinematic aspect is its use of lighting, as we're given a great variation of light to convey meaning, mood, and atmosphere without compromising the film's overall presentation. I think the film maintains a very consistent visual style, but what makes it stand out is its use of lighting and its use of light as a whole. So in this film, there are some very visually dramatic scenes that are only visually dramatic because of the way that the light is cast or the way that they have presented the light.
I was actually going to bring up this point as well for a slightly different reason. I noticed that there's a lot of warm tones in this movie and less under a different type of light, e.g. the moonlight or Tesla's light specifically.
Yeah.
As my sort of two ways of categorizing. This movie is very, very warm toned, but it still manages to convey nighttime and daytime very differently. It still manages to convey time of day, mood, setting, without really compromising that color palette in the more warm, quote-unquote vintage vibes of the film.
Well, yeah, that's the very thing I wanted to say, in that this film is based around the end of the 19th century. So it maintains a more tungsten-based lighting system, because that's, for the most part, all that housing had during that period of time. So it maintains a very consistent visual lighting style based on the time, but then it also doesn't compromise atmosphere and mood by using that more I'm not gonna say, I would say synthetic, but might say more LED based or unnatural lighting, fluorescent kind of lighting in points where it's needed. So the Tesla experiments and the Tesla lighting field, which I think is a really incredibly cool visual moment.
It
But
reminds me of going to Questacon and seeing
yeah,
all of their cool science experiments, which is exactly the vibe that you want of a scientist in a movie.
yeah, absolutely.
Leading,
I feel like we may need to explain, but Questacon, for those who don't know, because we actually don't have primarily Australian audience, but Questacon is basically a science exhibition company that that has like very specific, it has buildings and venues that are dedicated to explaining science in a really interesting and fun way for kids.
yeah,
And
it's
yeah,
basically a school staple if you grew up in Australia
yeah,
and had your more formative educational years in Australia. It's one of those things where everybody goes to a field trip to go to the science museum because it's
yeah,
just so interesting that kids actually end up learning things. It's got that very mad scientist in a movie vibe while still being very safe and
pretty
educational.
much, yeah. But you were going to lead on to something else, weren't you?
Yeah, I was going to say, moving on from the visuals
Yes.
for a more technical perspective, I wanted to know what you thought of the music in this movie.
Honestly, the music is very take it or leave it.
Mm.
The film doesn't stand out for its use of music. Its soundtrack, its score is very tailored to suit the film as much as it can without being overbearing. That's for Christopher Nolan's early period of filmmaking. That was pretty par for the course, as long as he wasn't making something that already had an established history like the Batman films. And I think the focus is always more for Christopher Nolan on story. Once he started working with Hans Zimmer, that story changed, like that background changed completely, and there was more emphasis on music. But for The Prestige, it suits it well. I don't think if it actually had a very recognizable soundtrack that stood out, I don't think it would make the film any better or worse than it is. I mean, sure, you could argue that if it had Chumbawamba in the background, it just wouldn't work. So ultimately, it suits its needs. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't overstay its welcome. It does what it does, and that's fine. Ultimately,
Yeah, I think a quote was Christopher Coleman of Track Sounds. He thought it was a perfectly fitting score, but it was
yeah,
overwhelmed by the film,
yeah,
and it goes really unnoticed at times. That's why I wanted to ask you about it,
yeah,
because it really
absolutely.
almost feels like there's no music in this film unless you're listening for it.
Pretty much. I don't think the film's there to tell a further story or reinforce the story. I think it's there to reinforce the atmosphere of the film, so it doesn't need to be in there too much. And I think for the sum of its parts, it does that job incredibly well because you don't notice it, but it still helps elevate the film. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think for the most part, it's not amazing, but it's also fine. You know, it still works really well. But with the conversation of music, I wanted to jump over to another thing, very much a staple of Christopher Nolan's directing style and his movies, is that he primarily uses practical effects for his films.
You might have to go a little bit more in depth for me there.
Yeah, so, well, for its time, The Prestige doesn't do anything wildly new, but with Christopher Nolan, like with his later films, including Interstellar and Inception, he uses practical effects for many of his more visually striking scenes, such as the city flipping over on top of itself. That is not a fully practical effect, but most of it is done in a practical way, so that it actually is done with, I don't know this exactly, but done with practical models and practical sets. So a better example actually is the spinning room in Inception that Joseph Gordon-Levitt has a fight scene in. That's an actual corridor that's been built onto a rig that turns.
Oh.
But with the Prestige, getting back to the Prestige, we'll talk about Inception at a different point, but it primarily uses a great deal of practical effects, so effects that are actually built practically into the world. And the only real uses of CG or visual effects or VFX is the lightning effects, because if you in the Prestige, if you actually use that, we would have had Hugh Jackman be struck by lightning, and that's not good. No one
Yeah,
wants
that would have ended real bad for Hugh.
Yeah, but the tricks themselves are all practical, other than the bird crushing stuff, because no animals were actually hurt in the making of this film. That would be fucking terrible.
Yeah, this movie is a really, really beautiful movie, but it does have some very explicit scenes, and one of the more upsetting ones is
A bird being
birds.
crushed.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't get crushed. You see the cage close, like snap shut, and then you see Borden dispose of a dead bird into a bin, basically.
Yeah, so...
A lot of this stuff is done practically, including the stage drops where one of the magicians will disappear off the stage and they basically just dropped onto... Well, Angier is dropped onto a pile of padding to soften his fall, but all that stuff is actually done practically in a way that, as a result, this film was made in 2006. It ages incredibly well. Because it doesn't
there's
rely...
not a lot of CGI, yeah.
Well, there's practically no CGI in this, which
It's
is
really only
really
the
good.
lighting that's sometimes CGI.
Yeah, as a result, unlike some of the other films of this time, 2006, it ages phenomenally well. And also as a result, you actually get a better chance as an audience member to see the background of the magic and the illusions that are being performed, because they have to make them practically real and make sure that they actually work in a practical way. So that also provides them with the great benefit that they can also show behind the scenes within the film as realistically as possible. And you get to see how the sausage is made in terms of the illusions that Angier and Borden are performing, without a way of making it feel like we're pulling back the curtain of the entire film. And I like that. I like that so much. And it's what makes this film so much more interesting, is because it's so intricate in the way that it is depicted. You can see all the way back into how the magic is performed by the performers and by the magicians. And so when it comes to the stage shows, you know what's going to happen in terms of the mechanics of the trick. And if it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, then you know partially why that is. And I think that's great. I think it's really, really cool.
It is really well done. I think I wouldn't have realised that this film was as old as it was unless I had the number out in front of me, just because it has aged really well.
Yeah, exactly.
And really the only other reason that you can tell that it's this old is because it's got very famous actors in it, and we're all very aware of what they look like nowadays, so
yeah,
you're like, oh, they look a bit young.
I would also argue that many of the actors in this have aged remarkably well.
Oh, they've all aged remarkably well.
They're all still consistently beautiful people,
for instance,
which is great for them.
Actors always are. But for Hugh Jackman specifically, I'm thinking, of course, of his franchise as Wolverine.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
How very...
He didn't necessarily age specifically. He just got bigger and bigger.
Yeah, it's weird to see
angrier.
him. Yeah, it's weird to see him looking less young and more just unburdened. And I understand that's because Wolverine is a very burdened character, both in muscles and in torment. But it's just, you see him and you're like, oh, he's not got little frown lines, like...
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Not the whole, like, oh, he's less big, he's got less of the rippling muscles, he's not the greatest showman yet. And all that stuff. Yeah, that's fair.
Which, very intriguing. I know that we said we'd stop talking about actors, but in The Greatest Showman and this one, they're both very performative people.
Yeah.
Who, at their core, are a little bit, if not a lot, deceptive, so...
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping it more on this film, I do want to just quickly outline a criticism I do have, as I know that we're getting short on time. One of my criticisms of this film is just that the format in which they tell this story is a little strange when you look at it on paper, in that it is a film that opens with a testimony from Michael Caine, which is always nice because Michael Caine's got a very nice voice, but it's a testimony and then it goes into one man reading the journal of a dead man that predominantly is about that man reading the journal of the guy who's reading his journal.
I will say that this movie was very disjointed at times, and sometimes it was very hard to follow the plot.
Yeah, and I think it's done purely to maintain that illusionist style of storytelling and presentation. For
It's
sure.
definitely done by design.
Yeah.
It's just not my favorite design.
No, absolutely. And for me, I can get past that, but the idea that for the most part of this film, we're just reading the reminiscing of one character who reminisces about reading a book that is written by the first character, and it's all in just kind of this like circular nature where we keep coming back to them reading the journal of this guy who's reading their journal, and it's just like,
Yeah,
this is a bit much.
it's Borden is reading a journal that was written by Angia,
Yeah.
who wrote the journal after decoding Borden's journal. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
And it's,
let's
yeah, it just
who
feels
are we
like,
reading?
oh, this
Yeah.
feels a bit all over the place. And it's also from two characters who are both magicians, so they both have a habit and a nature of being deceptive.
Yeah, and their writing style
So
is
we're
not that differential.
Yeah, and so we're never given the full facts, but you're just like, oh, cool, we're falling out of this moment, and then we're back to, a prison cell with Borden reading the book that Angia wrote in, and stuff like that. And that's my only real gripe with the film, is just that this format could possibly have been done a little more seamlessly.
Yeah,
But
it's a little disjointed at
yeah, but would
times.
that
It does it well,
detract
but
from
it's
the
still
film's
disjointed.
style, I think?
Very true.
But that's the question that I have, and I think because the film has come out and it was so widely successful, I will just state as a point of interest, the film's budget was 40 million and it took home 109.7 million at the box office, so incredibly successful
Dang.
for its time and for what it presents. So ultimately this critique is really not a whole lot, since the film is still successful, and I think an argument to our point is definitely that it lends really well to the film's style. But with all that said, do we want to get our final thoughts out?
I want to know what your rating for this one was, Will.
Fair enough. For me, I thought, well, first of all, we are rating this film on a scale of top hats. You'll understand. Watch the film, you'll understand why.
Watch the film, listen to the in-depth discussion. It will become very apparent why that's our rating system.
Yeah, well, if you watch the film, you're going to understand. Anyhow, but I gave it a 7 out of 10. The film is genuinely really enjoyable to watch. I think it's so much better on a second time through. Not saying that it falls short in any kind of capacity, but I think this film is so much more enjoyable on a second time through, in the way that first time through you're watching, you go, that was pretty good, I really liked that, and second time through you're like, I noticed all the really nice intricate foreshadowing. This film is so much better for that, and so I would recommend watch the film. If you haven't watched it already, watch it through again, because you're going to love it the second time through, I think. What about you?
I rated this one 8 out of 10 top hats. This film is one to me, and I really value this, that is worth the rewatch. It's a really, really good film when you first watch it, and when you get to the end of the film, you have a little bit of fulfillment about the foreshadowing that you were able to pick up. But the second time round, it is a much more fulfilling experience, as your little brain catches all of those extra details. So
Yeah, absolutely.
that's been our review of The Prestige. If you want to find us, I am on Twitter as Nexatai, and Will is on Instagram primarily as Will_Mortlock.
Yep.
And on Twitter as Grey Mouse Inc. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Please tune into our in-depth discussion. Thanks for listening.